Jim was a guy on our football team at Kings High School. We're in the Kings High School duds today, and we weren't duds back then, but he was a guy on our football team with the most fight. He played in both directions, offense and defense. He was our quarterback, and before every game, he would throw up. Jim, I don't think that would work very good on AstroTurf. I think he was throwing up because it was hard to see over the line, but he could jump. The opposing team would invariably barge into our locker room after each game. Jim's uniform, his white uniform, was black from head to foot with mud. And the opposing team would say, "Where's that scrappy little guy?" Because of Jim, I hold the Washington State football record after 55 years, the most time on the bench. King's class of 1962, I have the splinters in front of it. And 62 was the year that Jim and I both graduated from King's High School. And that was, and John Hubble here teaches at King's. Now, 62 was the year that there was only one injury on the football team. That was the time I fell off the bench. John says. Jim participated in just about every sport. On an intramural field day, he ran the hurdles. I didn't say he jumped the hurdles. The rule said he could go under the hurdles if he knocked them down. Jim went on to play football at Wheaton College and ended up as the chaplain for Stanford University's athletic department for 40 plus years, meeting with athletes one-on-one, upwards to 30 athletes a week, an hour at a time. He'd persuade athletes to meet with him by challenging them to ping pong. Here's these big strapping football players, and he'd say, I'd like to play ping pong with you, and if I win, you have to meet with me 1 hour a week. Sometimes he beat him 21-1. He worked alongside of the likes of Coach Jim Harbaugh, Richard Sherman, Coach Ty Willingham. Ty Willingham gave the Huskies a perfect record, 0-12. What's up with that? I thought you mentored them. You should have spent more time with Ty Willingham. Jim wrote the book, The Power of One-on-One, in which are some hair-raising stories and miracles. And I hope you'll pick up a copy tonight. Maybe even have him sign it. So please welcome my classmate, my teammate, and my friend, Jim Stump.
First thing I want to do is say thanks to my friend Dave for giving me this opportunity to pass on some of what I've learned through 45 years of sitting at the same table in a little cafe in the athletic complex at Stanford, meeting with athletes for an hour a week, leading them to faith in Jesus, and then mentoring them as they walked with Jesus individually. Let me give you some background apart from the lies Dave told. By the way, as he mentioned, I did, in response to the request, bring some copies of the book, and I'll be glad to stick around and sign them if you want that. But I had probably a different beginning for most of you. I spent the first year of my life in a tent in the wilds of Alaska, about 250 miles southwest of Anchorage. And I was telling Charlie about it a little earlier on Lake Iliamna. And as it turned out, it was the coldest winter in the history of what was then a territory. The temperature got down to 56 degrees below zero. And I think it froze my pituitary gland because I never grew much after that. But my parents were missionaries there in this little village of Pile Bay. And so it never got any bigger than 67 people. But that was what I grew up in. And I had my own dog team, my own trap line. You know, it was a wonderful way to grow up as a boy. When I was 12, my dad caught tuberculosis and had to be, it was a modern day miracle that saved his life. But we wound up in Seattle, where he was placed in a tubercular sanatorium. And he and Mom enrolled me in a Christian high school, King's High School. And I immediately got active in all the things you're supposed to get active in to be popular and successful, which at that age is pretty important. And by the time I graduated from King's, I'd been class president twice, student body president my senior year, captain of the football and baseball teams 2 years each. Not saying it to brag, I'm just saying that a lot of people fooled. There was supposedly this Christian leader. I could quote you from any part of the Bible. I could pray as eloquently as anyone else could. That was the context in which I'd grown up. But there was something missing, and I didn't know what it was. And I figured, well, college is where you get those questions answered. So I applied to Wheaton College, which had the reputation of being the best combination of academics and athletics on the Division III level. And it was a Christian college, and I knew some people who'd gone there that I had great respect for. So I figured maybe that's where I'll get my questions answered. I kind of did a redo of high school when I got to Wheaton. Wound up playing 4 sports. I was a class officer, student body officer. But those questions I began to ask were just pushed to the back of my mind. And I wasn't forced to face them again until the summer before my senior year. I had been elected to a student body office that placed me in charge of all the incoming freshmen and for that following year. So I figured some of those guys are going to be having similar questions to what I'd had. And for the first time, I looked in the mirror and I saw a phony, and that was tough for me. I said, you know, Jim, you promised yourself you were going to get these questions answered, and you didn't do it. So I went back to Alaska, fished in Bristol Bay. That's how I worked my way through Wheaton. And had a lot of time to think that summer, and I came to the conclusion that I just hadn't tried hard enough. And so I went back to Wheaton for my senior year, determined to read 1 chapter out of the Bible every day, pray every day, go to church every Sunday. And I did all that. And all it got me was more frustration. And finally I just said, hey, I've given it my best shot. It just doesn't work for me. Everybody, if you had asked them, they would have said I was a great Christian. You know, I had all the verses memorized and everything else. But I wasn't trying to be a phony, but I hadn't pursued what I needed to do. So I did all those things, just got me more frustrated, and I went back to my dorm one night, and I thought, you know, this just doesn't work. I don't know why. And my phone rang, and it was a girl I was dating, and she said, would you come and pick me up? There's a guy that's going to be speaking on campus here tonight, and I would love to hear him, but I'd love to spend some time with you. And she was gorgeous. And I said, any chance, I didn't say it, but I was thinking, any chance to spend time with her, I was very much up for that. So we went to this meeting, and I heard a man speak, and he was recruiting for a group of young college graduates that were going to be in training in the U.S. for a year, and then go to Europe and start the ministry of some organization called Campus Crusade for Christ. And that was way too, it just didn't sound right for me. You know, I thought, I don't need that. That sounds a little too much for me. But I listened to what he had to say, and I was intrigued, not so much by what he had to say, but who he was. There was just a quality about him that was unique. And there were probably 300 students in that room to hear him speak that night. And after he'd finished speaking, I was just sitting there in my chair. My girlfriend was up, you know, talking to other friends. And I was contemplating what he had said. I'd already been accepted in graduate school. I was going to get my master's degree and go into coaching and teaching. That's what I wanted to do all my life. And so as I was sitting there thinking, I saw this person in front of me. I looked up, and it was Bud. And he introduced himself, and he said, I'd really like to talk to you about becoming a part of this group that I'm recruiting and getting ready to go to Europe. And I said, thanks, bud, appreciate that. But I got my pathway laid out here, and I'm going to go into coaching and teaching. And he said, well, wonderful. Tell you what, why don't you meet me in the student union tomorrow at noon, and I'll buy lunch. And I said, you'll buy lunch? You're on. As a broke college student, anytime you can get a free lunch, you take it. And again, there was just that quality of life about him that was unique. He knew God in a way that I didn't, and had rarely seen in other people. And so I determined to keep my mouth shut and my ears open, and I reported to this training conference they had that summer. He said he'd pay my way, and I said, why not? A free vacation in California. So as I got to that conference and began talking to people, I was amazed at the quality of people. They all seemed to have a similar quality to Bud. And the second night I was there, another young man spoke, and he could have been reading my biography as he talked about what his life had been like before he had found reality in life. And I saw through his talk that it wasn't enough just to believe in God, which I'd always done, believe that Jesus was the Son of God, which I'd always done, but I found that through his talk that I had to give up control of my life to God and allow him to come into my life and begin to make me the kind of man he created me to be. And I was following him until the big C word came up, control. And immediately I started rationalizing and saying, well, I've done a pretty good job in my life, with me in control. After all, look at what I've accomplished. But through all that accomplishment, quote unquote, I never found peace. So I thought, why not give it a shot? So I walked out of the room that night, sat down under a palm tree in Southern California, prayed a simple prayer. I just said, Jesus, I know a lot about you because I've heard about you my whole life, but I don't know you. And I'd like that. So right now I'm opening the door of my life, inviting you to come in, and I want you to make me the kind of man you created me to be. And then I thanked him for coming in. I'd invited him in several times before, mainly right before my dad was getting ready to spank me. Saying, God, would you please protect me from this man? Never happened. But that night, something was different. And I thanked him for coming in. I took that step of faith. And then I just sat there. I didn't know what to expect. It was a beautiful Southern California night. I didn't know if I should see shooting stars or angels kind of right above the trees or, and nothing happened except that for the first time in my life, I was at peace. And that was significant for me. It kind of freaked me out because I was a biology major at Wheaton and didn't want to be psyching myself into anything. But I went back to my room, went to sleep, slept like a baby, woke up the next morning, and there was a Gideon Bible on the table next to the bed. And I looked at it, and it was almost a frantic response. I said, I've got to get to know Jesus. And I flipped open the Bible to the book of John in the New Testament and began to read. And not to be overly dramatic, but it was like the words were leaping off the page at me. And again, that kind of freaked me out. But I just thought, I'm going to take it step by step. And that was the beginning of my walk. Obviously, I didn't go to graduate school. I joined this group of young men and women that went to Europe to start the ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ. And so that's my story. And at the age of 73, I can look back over my life and say, I've got a mother-in-law who's 96 and a half years old. I've got a grandson who's 15 months old. Kind of a pretty broad spectrum. One thing about my grandmother, she's, like I said, almost 97. She'll be 97 here in a couple of months. And she was still living in her home in California and taking care of herself until she fell in August and broke her pelvis. Mm-hmm. So we went out there and took care of her and then have moved her to Texas. We live just outside Dallas now. And we moved her into an assisted living place about 10 minutes away from us. But, she's starting to slow down. She's running the assisted living facility now. Nobody can believe that she's almost 97 years old, because she's got everything there, and she's always been identified as the Energizer Bunny. But she lost her husband a year and a half ago, and that kind of slowed her down a bit. And I was out there last February, a year ago, to help her with her taxes. She was still doing her own taxes at that age. And she finally said, I think I need some help. So I went out there, and one evening she was complaining to me that bored because all of her friends were dead. And I said, well, the positive side of that is that you're not. You're still alive. And then I suggested that she watch more TV and videos, and she said she was going blind, so that didn't work real well. So I said, you ought to listen to the radio. And she said she was losing her hearing. So I suggested she take a walk, and she said that her legs hurt, and she couldn't walk very well. So I suggested that she knit or sew. I'm trying to be a good son-in-law here. And she said her arthritis was too bad, and she couldn't really grip the needles. And so I said, I'm really sorry for you. And she said, well, it's not all bad. At least I can still drive. By the way, I will not drive with her. But if you can believe this maybe is an indication of the state of California and the mess they're in. But they just sent her a 5-year extension on her driver's license. Let me begin this morning with a question. Who are the people who have helped you to be who you are today? I'm referring to people who have marked you, who've had a significant impact on your life, a lasting impression. The individuals who, at a critical point in your life, may have redirected your path in such a way that today you look back and say, if it had not been for that individual, I would not be who I am today. I'm thinking primarily of individuals outside your family, a coach, a teacher, a youth pastor, someone in your church, people who've had little, if any, vested interest in your life. But nonetheless, they've invited you into their lives in a way that has indelibly marked you as a human being. If you can remember someone who fits that description, then you know by experience what a deep and lasting difference a relationship like that can make. In Atlanta, there's a young man who leads a group called the Capital Group. It's an association of more than 400 guys in their 20s and 30s who've expressed a commitment to learn how to honor Jesus in every area of their lives. Recently, the gentleman who was leading it polled the entire group to find out how many meet with an older man for advice, encouragement, accountability, prayer. Guess how many said they did out of the 400? 2%. 2% of them said that they were meeting with someone. Then the follow-up question was, if you could have that opportunity, would you be interested? Guess what percentage that got?
98.
Exactly, 98. The other 98%. So I've had a wonderful mentor who just graduated to heaven at the age of 94. He had 3 engineering degrees from Stanford University. He was co-founder of probably the top engineering consulting firm of its kind in the world. He's been an elder at one of the most respected churches in Silicon Valley for over 50 years. Spent many years on the board of Fuller Seminary. And he's just been an amazing person in my life. And he was the guy that was just always there for me. I loved meeting with him for breakfast every time while I was still there, and then now that anytime I can go back there, I just loved meeting with him when I was back in that area, partly because he always bought breakfast, but you guys will wake up in a minute. But mainly because he had a vast, deep reservoir of wisdom and spiritual depth. And he answered every question I had by quoting me several verses out of the Bible that applied to the situation. And One of my heroes in life is a man named Howie Hendricks, and some of you may have heard of him. He was a professor at Dallas Seminary for many years, and recently went home to heaven in his 90s. He died of cancer, but he greatly impacted my life in so many ways. We first met at a conference in the late 1970s when we had something in common. He was the chaplain to the Dallas Cowboys, and I was the chaplain to the San Francisco 49ers. And that was back when very few teams had chaplains. And they all do now, I think, except for maybe the Raiders. I don't know. They may even have one by now. But Howie was one of the most gifted communicators I've ever been around. We'd sit and talk and just kind of share stories and share our ignorance, basically, and just try to encourage each other on what we'd learned that seemed to work. But in his book, As Iron Sharpens Iron, which, by the way, I'd encourage all of you to buy and read, he talks about a man literally taking him off the street at the age of 10 and taking him to church and helping him become a follower of Jesus. If that man had not been available to pour his life into Howie Hendricks' life, I know I wouldn't be the same man I am today. Millions of other people that he has taught through his seminary classes, through his tapes, all around the world in seminars. Just an amazing man, had a powerful impact. And, we're all looking for ways to get ahead in the world. But let me ask you two simple questions. If you had one or more people that you admired a great deal in your life that would offer themselves and their resources to you to help you reach your professional goals in the next few years, would you take advantage of that, and do you think it would accelerate your progress? I think so. Second, if you had one or more mentors, would you be more stable when a crisis occurred? Notice I didn't say if a crisis occurred. I said when. Because we've all had crises in our lives. And if you haven't had one up to now, just hang around. You'll be there. But we need people in our lives. I love what this whole group is all about. Men encouraging men. Because we all need men in our lives. The mentoring relationships increase the rate of organizational growth. They reduce turnover. They maintain organizational stability. So there are a lot of advantages to having a mentor in your life. Mentoring simply accelerates the speed with which you'll get where you're going. And here's a key, and don't miss this. In addition to having access to your mentor's knowledge and experience, you have the invaluable opportunity to be introduced to that mentor's network of friends, which can open up a wide world of opportunities for you. So wherever you turn today, men are looking for a guide, a coach, a model, an advisor. Essentially what they're looking for is a mentor. How many of you have heard of the Apostle Paul? Mm-hmm. Good. I expected that. Now, how many of you have heard of a Jew named Joseph from the Isle of Cyprus? The scriptures don't really tell us how he came to be a follower of Jesus. They really don't. That's kind of surprising. Perhaps he was among the 3,000 people when Peter preached that great sermon the day of Pentecost. 3,000 people came to faith. They responded to his proclamation of the gospel in Acts chapter 2. Whatever the circumstances, the message of the Messiah really resonated and took root in his life. And he began to identify with the early church. As an indication of his commitment to Jesus, Joseph sold some or all of his property on Cyprus, and he brought the proceeds to Jerusalem and donated them to the church's benevolent fund. And as was the custom of the church in the early days there, the church leaders responded by changing his name, giving him a new name, Son of Encouragement, or Barnabas, exactly. Now, how is it that Barnabas, who's a relatively minor character in Scripture, could be said to have changed history? Well, it's because Barnabas came to the aid of Saul, later known as the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament. And This was right after his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus. And Barnabas began to mentor Saul in his faith. So, were it not for Barnabas, who knows for sure what would have happened to the early church in that day? Or to Paul? Who really knows? So while we think of Paul as the strategic spokesman for the early church in the New Testament, we must never forget that behind a Paul, there was a Barnabas. So we're all faced with major challenges in our lives. How do I maximize the amount of time that I have in my 24 hours? How can I be most efficient in the manner in which I use those hours? Well, how we choose to answer that question can have a huge ramification for our spouses if we're married, for our families, and for the kingdom. So where do we find a model upon which we can pattern our lives? Well, as you look at the Gospels, obviously our Lord was there, committed to putting his plan into place to see the world reached with the good news. And we read how he was constantly checking in with the Father to make sure he was on track, but he never slowed down. He knew what was coming. And the scriptures make it plain that he always had his eye on the cross, realizing that his days were few before he could make that ultimate sacrifice. And with all the multitudes demanding his attention, he spent 90% of those invaluable 3 years with 12 men. Think about that. He stayed focused on his plan to pour his life into those 12 men. And those 12 men all went out and changed the world after the Holy Spirit fell on them and filled them at Pentecost. For those of you who may not have read it yet, I would strongly encourage you buying Robert Coleman's classic, The Master Plan of Evangelism. It's the best thing I've found outside the Gospels for a ministry manual. In the book, Coleman lays out the principles that Jesus used to train his men to go change the world. Believe it or not, 2 years ago, 2016, marked the beginning of the 6th decade that I've been involved in sports ministry. I know I'm not even 60 years old, but my last 45 years that I spent at Stanford were pretty significant. I left there 2 years ago and moved to Texas. All 9 of our grandkids have moved there, and my wife said, "You can stay at Stanford if you want. I'm moving to Texas." So just to keep the family together and my relationship with my wife, we've been married 42 years now. But so we moved there. But I don't know how many more years I have on this earth before my Lord calls me home to heaven. But my goal is, and has always been, to have the greatest impact for the kingdom that I can possibly have in the years that the Lord leaves me here. So I have geared my ministry to accomplish that. And I believe that the most efficient way of investing my time is to pour what I have learned about building God's kingdom into the lives of these athletes and empower them and challenge them to go out and change their world, wherever that they are planted by the Lord. So I'm not nearly as efficient as Jesus was. All he needed was 12. So in those years at Stanford, I chose to meet with approximately 30 to 35 guys a week, one-on-one, on an ongoing basis, pouring my life into theirs, given their workout and practice schedules. That's all the time slots I had available. And those time slots were filled up every quarter, and I usually had about 20 athletes that would contact me and say, if anybody calls you and says they got to study for a midterm or something, just let me know, because I'd like to fill in that hour. And my work week began on Monday morning at 8 a.m., where I met with my first guy in my office, which was the sports cafe in the athletic complex. I had a table in the corner, and all the athletes called that my office. It was a private place in a very public setting. And so the guys felt safe. So I'd meet with my first guy at 8 o'clock, and at 9 o'clock he would go to class and the next guy would slide in. At 10 o'clock he'd go to class and the next guy would slide in. And that's the way it went all day, and I just loved it. I loved the opportunity I had there. During that hour that I invested with each guy each week, it was all about building a relationship with him and building a love for Jesus into him. Most of that first half hour I would spend just catching up, finding out what was going on in their lives and their sport, in the dorm with their families, whatever. And then we got into the Word. Another thing I did was I always asked guys what their spiritual journey was, because I wanted to get an idea of where they were coming from. And that was always very beneficial. And then I would take them through a little booklet called Would You Like to Know God Personally? I've got a couple of them here that I just always carry with me. But I never wanted to take anything for granted, no matter what their background was. So that hour was a place where they could come and ask questions regarding feedback on what some of their liberal professors were trying to cram down their throats, or questions that came up in dorm bull sessions, or even in the locker room. What their peers were pushing them toward. And especially those freshmen that I would meet with, a lot of them were being faced with oftentimes radically different values than they had been raised with. And so they would come and say, what about this? This is what my peers are saying that I should be doing and thinking and saying, and that's not the way I was raised, but I want to be cool. So how do you handle that? Well, Saturdays were spent at their games or matches or wherever, so I could talk specifically with them from firsthand observation of what had gone on during the week, during our hour together, talk about the results of what had happened. And I was at also pretty much every football practice. During Gatorade or water breaks at practice, I would interact with the lads, because as the old saying goes, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So the point is that I needed a larger funnel than Jesus did. So from the 30 to 35 I met with regularly, some guys began to separate themselves as people who were really serious and mature enough about their walk with God to recognize the value of having someone coach them through the spiritual side of their life as well as life itself. So when I was a new believer, I just joined the staff of Campus Crusade for Christ, and Athletes in Action. I was actually Athletes in Action's second staff person back in the day. That tells you how old I am. But one day I asked Bill Bright what he looked for in a staff member, and he said, "Jim, I look for two things. I look for a heart for God, and I look for a teachable attitude." So those are two things that I look for in every guy that I mentor. And I've added to that, not to say anything bad about Bill Bright, because he's an amazing man, but I've added a growing commitment to being obedient to God's calling on their lives. So I look for a heart for God, teachable attitude, and a growing commitment to being obedient to God's calling on their lives. Most summers I would take a couple of them to Alaska to speak in some youth camps and villages, and then we'd go out and to my old log cabin, and we'd do a little fishing. And one of the guys I took on that trip was a guy who I talk about in my book, but his name was Brett Pierce, and I'll bring him up because he was from the state of Washington, a good Washingtonian. And Brett was an interesting guy. The fellow who was recruiting him recruited the Northwest, and so I had known the coach since he was playing at Stanford back in the early 70s. And Dave came down to me and he said, "Jim, we got a guy coming in this weekend that I need your help on. He's from the Northwest, and he's first team All-State in 3 different sports, and he's a brilliant guy, and every campus in the country wants him, but we really need him here at Stanford. So he's coming down on his recruiting trip, and I told him about you and your background in Alaska, and he wants to meet you." So I showed up at the dinner that night, and it was a relatively small room, and there were only 5 guys, I think, that were there on their recruiting trips. So we had name tags on, and I walked in one door of the room, and across the room, Brett filled up the whole doorway as he walked through the other room. He was about 6'6", 250 as a senior in high school. And he was there with his dad, and he saw me, and he came across the room in about 3 steps and literally began jabbing me in the chest with his finger, trying to intimidate me. And he said, "I know who you are. I know you play ping pong. And I want you to know that if I come to Stanford, I'm going to kick your ass." I'm sorry. Are we in a church? Can I say that? Anyway, that's quote unquote. We'll leave it there. And I said, "Well, Brett, if you come to Stanford, I promise to give you the chance to try." And he said, I've never been beaten. So I just want you to know that. And so, sure enough, he came to Stanford after his first practice the next fall. As he was coming off the field, he came running over and he said, I want you on the table in the dorm tonight. We're going to play table tennis, and I'm going to kick your ass. And I said, well, okay, I'll be there. And so I showed up and watched him play. And he was a good player, a great reach, tall guy. And so I waited my turn, and finally, whoever won stayed on the table. And so Brett was beating everybody else. And he said, okay, Stump, it's your turn. Get on the table. And I said, well, Brett, that's not the way it goes around here. Here's how it goes. If you beat me, you never have to talk to me again. But if I beat you, you have to start meeting with me on a weekly basis, and you have to go to church with me on Sunday. And he said, well, that'll never happen because I'm going to kick your ass. Now get on the table. And so I pulled my paddle out of its case left-handed and began to warm up with him playing left-handed. And we were exchanging points, pretty much even. Finally he said, okay, I'm ready. And I said, you don't mind if I use my good hand now, do you? It's the only time in my life where I've seen a guy actually turn pale right in front of me. And I knew I had him. And I beat him 21-1. He very meekly came around the table and said, oh, okay, so when do we start meeting? And a couple of weeks out, he was a very, very bright guy, had some great questions, but I was able to answer those questions because I'd done my homework. And about 2 weeks later, he committed his life to follow Jesus. And wound up with an undergraduate and a master's degree from Stanford in civil engineering before playing 4 years as a tight end with the Cowboys and the Broncos, and he was the team chaplain for the Cowboys when he was there. But I took him to Alaska with me on one of those trips, and he told me that he'd learned more on that trip than he'd learned in 4 years of taking classes at Stanford, which is amazing because, I didn't all of a sudden become a brilliant professor of life, but somehow it took in a new and special way. I didn't all of a sudden become the man who had all the answers, but I'll tell you this, I was with him pretty much every minute of every day during those 2 weeks that we were up there. And, it's kind of what Jesus did, isn't it? I mean, when Jesus brought his disciples to him, do you remember the words he said to them? It wasn't real brilliant. I mean, he didn't give them a doctrinal thesis. What did he say?
Follow me.
Follow me. That's what he said. Let's hang out together. Let's do life. And so that's where we were. Most athletes are not going to open up and be vulnerable in group situations, Bible studies, chapel services, things like that. And those things are great, but they're wonderful ways to teach biblical principles. But if you just go in that direction, guys are not going to open up and tell you what's really going on in their lives in that setting, as long as there's a peer at the table. So I believe our major focus needs to be on mentoring this next generation. Everyone needs someone safe that they can come and talk to. My last year at Stanford, I had 3 different guys come to me when we were traveling to play on the road. 3 different guys come that I had never met with one-on-one. But they came to me and something had just gone downhill real fast in their lives on that trip. One of them had found out that his mom had just gotten cancer. One of them had found out that his best friend from high school had been killed in a car crash. They couldn't go to their coach and say, Coach, let me tell you about what just happened and turn my life upside down, because they were afraid the coach would say, well, then you're not focused on the game, so you're not going to play. But they needed to tell someone, so they came to me because they trusted me. Almost all the guys on our teams were stars in high school. By the time you get to this level, most guys were stars, and they soon learned that not everybody on the team is going to start. If they're confident in their abilities, they can't go to their coach and say, Coach, you're an idiot. You ought to be playing me ahead of that guy. But they can come to me and say, Jim, my coach is an idiot. He ought to be playing me ahead of that guy. And they kind of get it off their chest, and then I can give them some perspective on what God may be trying to teach them through that situation. And that's validated over and over again through the years as we see the results in the kids' lives. I was in Spokane not long ago to do a wedding for a professional baseball player who had become a follower of Jesus with me his freshman year at Stanford. And I had met with him all 4 years he was there. And at the reception afterwards, I was sitting with his father, who was not a believer, by the way. But he said to me, Jim, it's a wonderful thing that you do for those athletes at Stanford. He said, I truly believe that Jason would not have made it through his freshman year at Stanford if you had not been there to meet with him every week. I think he would have left because of all the frustrations he found on the field and in the classroom. You helped guide him through all those minefields, and we'll be eternally grateful to you for that. Well, Jason not only went on to become a first-team All-American baseball player, but far more importantly, he was instrumental in leading his mom and his younger brother to faith in Jesus. So let me close with this morning. In John chapter 15, verse 16, Jesus said, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Well, everyone invests their life in something by virtue of just living. No moment can be saved for another day. Time once spent can never be recaptured. So if this life is the seed time of eternity, how do you best spend your life preparing for your time with God in heaven in eternity? The scriptures answer this question by telling you to invest in the fruit that will last. What is the fruit that lasts? The Bible tells us that is human beings. That imperishable fruit is human beings. And you never know what the ripple effect is going to be as you walk through life. I'll just tell you another quick story. I was in Seoul, Korea for the '88 Olympics, and I was giving some seminars at a conference we had for about 500 people from 120 countries of the world that were there to either learn how to start a sports ministry in their country or learn how to grow their sports ministry. And so I flew 13 hours over there. There were guys on either side of me were NFL offensive linemen. And so you can imagine how I felt by the time I got there. I was kind of like this. And we got off the plane and went right to the place where everybody was saying. It was a YMCA in Seoul. And there were 8 people to a room, 4 bunk beds. And so I was the first one to check into my room. It was 10:30 at night, but I was the first one there. So I got in the top bunk right inside the door because I didn't want somebody coming in, and if I was on the bottom bunk, when they vaulted up to the top, they'd stick their foot in my face or something like that. So I was protecting myself. But during the night, I was awakened several times with people who came in, and I remember a guy rolled into the bunk bed right below me. And the next morning, when the alarm went off, the guy right below me was one of those guys you love to hate, in the morning. Because he bounced out of bed and he said, "Good morning, everyone. My name is Jean-Paul." And then he went around to each person and said, "Hi, I'm Jean-Paul. What's your name?" And he finally got to me and I said, "Hi, Jean-Paul. My name is Jim Stump." And he said, "No, you're Jim Stump?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Why do you say it like that?" And he said, "Well, do you remember a guy that you led to Christ in England?" And he mentioned the guy's name, and I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, after you left and went back to the United States, that guy finished his degree, and then he came to the University of Paris. And I was an atheist, second-year student at the University of Paris, just eating my lunch one day, and this guy came up and sat down next to me, and we began to talk. And after several meetings, I committed my life to follow Jesus as a result of that. And I said, "Well, what's your job now? What are you doing now? What brings you here?" And he said, "I'm the chaplain to the French Olympic Committee." And
He was just there that one night, and then he went to the Olympic Village later that day. And so God brought me all the way from California, brought him all the way from France. We met in Seoul, Korea, 500 people. He was in the bunk right below me, just so he could encourage both of us. Now, isn't that just like God? Isn't that amazing? That's something only he could do. So, another one of the guys I led to Christ at Stanford his freshman year, and he went on to be a star there, broke some of John Elway's records, and then played in the NFL for 5 years. Now he's the president of Pro Athletes Outreach that was headquartered right here in Issaquah for many, many years. And then Norm Evans, who was the president, had a stroke and had to leave. But Steve was asked to take over as president. So he's moved the office to Colorado. But he is having a phenomenal impact in the life of professional athletes. So you never know where this is going, okay? I just want to encourage you with that. You know, Jesus invested his life in people. When he died for people. In John 6:27, he urged his followers, do not work for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to eternal life. People are important, man. People last forever. Let me encourage you with this. If you're not being mentored yet, find a mentor. And if you are being mentored, find someone else to mentor. There's a huge need for that in our world. Never forget that you're looking for a person who cares about you, who believes in you, and encourages you. A mentor is someone who probably will tell you the truth when he shouldn't, but he'll do it in a nice way. So it's been said that 90% of our impact will come after we die. How many of you know how many people Jesus left behind when he went back to heaven after the resurrection? That the scriptures say?
Everybody?
500. Jesus left 500 people on this earth. How many are believers today around the world? Billions. So, I've chosen to invest my life in people like Jesus did. People are important. So if you want immortality, if you want to live on after your death, find someone to mentor and pass it. Not just one necessarily, but more if you can. There's a miraculous joy and wonder that comes with knowing that you've invested yourself in another person. You've invested yourself in such a way that it goes on, it multiplies, it spreads around the world, it continues through time. So consider Jesus' final command. Go and build big, beautiful buildings. That's not what he said, was it? No. There's nothing wrong with big, beautiful buildings. I mean, here we are. But he said, go and build people. Go and make disciples who will follow in his way. So the Lord was describing a ministry of multiplication. And if I understand my New Testament correctly, there are only two things that God is going to take off this planet. One is his word, and the other one is his people. So if you're building his word into people, you can be confident that you're building a legacy that will last through eternity. So I really appreciate this time together this morning. Thank you, Dave, for inviting me, and for the rest of you who made it possible. And I'd like to close with a word of prayer right now. And I don't know, some of you may be in the same situation that I was for the first 22 years of my life. You know, where you kind of played the good role. People look at you and say, that guy's a good person. He comes to church. But maybe you've never actually invited Jesus to come into your life and begin a relationship with him. And I think I'd be cheating you if I didn't give you at least that opportunity this morning. No pressure. But I'm going to close and pray a prayer similar to the one I prayed when I started my relationship with Jesus. And I'm going to pray out loud. If you want to pray silently, it's just between you and God. It's nobody's He's looking around. So I want to give you that opportunity. So let's pray right now. And if you'd like to, follow me in this prayer quietly as I pray out loud. Lord Jesus, I need you, and that's pretty tough for me to admit. But right now, I'd like to thank you for dying on the cross for my sins. I'd like to open the door of my life and invite you to come in. And I want you to make me the kind of man that you created me to be. All the pressure's on you, Lord, not on me. So, you promised that you'd come in if I invited you to come in. So thank you for coming in, just like you promised when I just now invited you in. Make me the kind of man that you want me to be, and I'll trust you.